The plasma beam missed Corvin Tilright's head by mere inches, searing through the golden wheat where he'd been standing moments before. The acrid smell of burnt grain filled his nostrils as he dove behind his ancient harvester, its rusted hull providing scant protection against whatever alien monstrosity had just tried to vaporize him. "Well, that's new," Corvin muttered, spitting dirt from his mouth. In 43 years of farming the Outer Rim colony of Verdant Prime, he'd dealt with droughts, floods, locust swarms, and even the occasional tax collector, but alien death rays were definitely a first. The ground shook as something massive landed in his wheat field. Through the gaps in the harvester's chassis, Corvin caught glimpses of obsidian carapace and writhing tentacles. The creaturely, the size of his farmhouse, emitted a sound like grinding metal mixed with a dying wail. Magnificent, Corvin thought with the kind of detached appreciation that only came from a lifetime of dealing with agricultural disasters. Whatever it is, it's definitely not covered by my crop insurance. The alien's second shot obliterated his scarecrow, turning old Jeremiah into a brief, spectacular fireball. Corvin had built that scarecrow himself, complete with his late father's overalls and a genuine straw hat from Earth. Now it was ash on the wind. That made it personal. "Listen here, you overgrown space lobster," Corvin called out, surprising himself with his own calm. "I don't know what your problem is, but you just torched a family heirloom. Around these parts, that's considered poor manners." The creature's response was another plasma bolt that turned a section of wheat into glass. Corvin rolled to his left, coming up behind an irrigation control box. His hands found the familiar weight of his plasma rifle, standard issue for rim farmers dealing with the occasional predator. The weapon was older than his marriage and twice as reliable. "Now, I'm going to give you one chance to apologize and replant my wheat," Corvin continued, checking his rifle's charge. "Otherwise, we're going to have ourselves a disagreement." The alien's laugh was like breaking glass. When it spoke, the words formed directly in Corvin's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "Foolish primate. Your species knows nothing of true power. I am Kethfrek, herald of the consuming dark. Your pathetic world will be the first domino in our conquest of this spiral arm." Kethrak. Corvin pronounced the name carefully. "That's quite a mouthful. Mind if I call you Queenie?" The psychic shriek of rage that followed nearly knocked him unconscious. Corvin took that as a no. "You dare mock a servant of the eternal void. I will feast on your terror before I consume your essence." "See? That's where you made your mistake," Corvin said, rising from cover. His rifle was steady in his hands, muscle memory from decades of protecting livestock guiding his movements. "You think fear is what keeps farmers going, but you're wrong." Kethfrek reared up, plasma building between its mandibles. "Then what drives you, little human?" "Stubbornness," Corvin replied, and pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt caught the alien's center mass, eliciting another shriek. The creature staggered, but didn't fall. Its carapace showed a smoking crater where Corvin's shot had connected, but the damage seemed superficial. "Impossible. Your primitive weapon cannot harm one such as I." "Maybe not," Corvin admitted, ejecting the spent power cell. "But I've got 37 more shots, and nowhere else to be today." What followed was the strangest battle of Corvin's life. He moved through his own fields like a guerrilla fighter, using irrigation ditches for cover, ducking behind grain silos, and leading the increasingly frustrated alien on a chase through acres of carefully cultivated wheat. Every shot he landed seemed to do a little more damage, the alien's regenerative abilities apparently not keeping pace with sustained fire. The turning point came when Kethrak, in a rage-fueled frenzy, triggered Corvin's automated sprinkler system. The alien's scream this time was different, not anger, but genuine pain. Where the water touched its carapace, the obsidian surface began to dissolve like sugar in rain. "Well, I'll be damned," Corvin said, watching the creature writhe. "You're allergic to H2O. Should have mentioned that before you invaded an agricultural world." He turned the sprinklers to maximum pressure. 20 minutes later, all that remained of the herald of the consuming dark was a puddle of rapidly evaporating goo and the lingering smell of ozone. Corvin stood in the middle of his ruined wheat field, surveying the damage with the resignation of a man who'd seen too many crop failures to get properly worked up about one more. His cum unit chose that moment to crackle to life. "Corvin, Corvin, are you there?" The voice belonged to Nix Valerian, the colony's administrator, and the closest thing Verdant Prime had to a military commander. "I'm here, Nix," Corvin replied. "Just finished dealing with a pest problem. Thank the stars. We've been tracking an alien vessel in the system for the past hour. Long-range sensors suggest it's some kind of scout ship. We're organizing the—" "Militia, no need," Corvin interrupted. "Crisis is over. The scout's been ... terminated." There was a long pause. "Corvin, please tell me you didn't just say what I think you said." "Depends on what you think I said. Did you just single-handedly defeat an alien invasion?" Corvin looked at the puddle that had been Kethrak, then at his destroyed scarecrow, then at the smoking ruins of what had been his best wheat crop in years. "I wouldn't call it an invasion," he said finally. "More like a very rude trespasser, with poor timing and a water allergy." The cum unit was silent for so long that Corvin thought the connection had been lost. When Nix finally spoke, her voice was strangely subdued. "Corvin, I need you to stay exactly where you are. We've got incoming ships, lots of them, and they're not human." Corvin looked up at the sky, where new stars were beginning to appear in broad daylight. As he watched, they resolved into the angular shapes of spacecraft, dozens of them, all heading directly for Verdant Prime. "Let me guess," he said. "Friends of Queenie's. That seems likely. The lead ship is broadcasting on all frequencies. Something about avenging their herald and purging the spiral arm of inferior life forms." Corvin sighed and shouldered his rifle. "Well, that's just perfect. Nix, you better evacuate the town. I'll try to buy you some time." "With what, Corvin?" "These aren't crop dusters. Our sensors are reading energy signatures that could glass half the continent." "Maybe so," Corvin replied, watching the alien fleet grow larger. "But they've got the same problem their advanced scout had, which is—" Corvin smiled grimly and activated every sprinkler system on his 10,000-acre farm. They picked a fight with a farmer on his own land. The first alien ship landed in his south field, crushing his prize-winning tomatoes. The second one took out his apple orchard. By the time the third ship touched down in his cornfield, Corvin Tilwright had stopped counting the agricultural damage and started counting targets. After all, he had a reputation to maintain, and in the farming business, reputation was everything. The War Council convened in what used to be Corvin's kitchen, though calling it a War Council felt pretentious to a man who'd spent the morning arguing with his chickens about egg production quotas. Around his farmhouse table sat the hastily assembled leadership of humanity's first interstellar defense force, Admiral Yuki Nakamura, fresh from her promotion from Colonial Defense Coordinator, General Maxim Volkov, whose experience with orbital bombardment came from deflecting asteroids rather than commanding fleets, and Dr. Indira Chakraborty, the xenobiologist who'd become humanity's leading expert on hostile alien physiology by virtue of being the only person who'd studied Corvin's defeated enemies. "Tell me again how you knew about the water weakness," Admiral Nakamura said, her dark eyes intense as she studied the tactical display hovering above Corvin's coffee maker. Corvin poured himself another cup of his homebrew coffee, the kind that could strip paint and had kept him functional through countless harvest seasons. "I didn't know," he admitted. "Lucky guess. When something's causing trouble in my fields, I try different solutions until one works. Water's usually the first thing I reach for." Dr. Chakraborty looked up from her portable lab setup, where she'd been analyzing samples of the deceased herald. "It's not just water, actually. It's the specific mineral composition of your irrigation system. The calcium and magnesium content creates a catalytic reaction with their silicon-based cellular structure. In effect, they're living glass that dissolves in hard water. Fancy way of saying they melt, General Volkov observed. Essentially, yes. But here's the problem. This weakness only applies to the Shivari Collective's warrior caste, the species that attacked us yesterday. She gestured to the holographic display showing the alien fleet in orbit. Intelligence suggests there are at least 14 different species in their armada, each with different physiologies and, presumably, different vulnerabilities. Corvin studied the alien ships through his kitchen window. They hung in the sky, like malevolent stars, occasionally launching reconnaissance drones that he'd taken to shooting down with his hunting rifle whenever they flew to look. So we need to figure out what makes each species tick, then exploit their weaknesses. In theory, yes, Admiral Nakamura said. In practice, we have no idea how to do that without extensive field testing, which generally involves letting them try to kill us first. Sounds like pest control to me, Corvin said. You identify the pest, figure out what kills it, then apply the solution on a larger scale. General Volkov snorted. These aren't aphids, farmer. They're an intergalactic armada with enough firepower to sterilize half the sector. Maybe, Corvin acknowledged, but they're still following patterns. Look at their behavior since they arrived. He pulled up the tactical display, his weathered fingers surprisingly nimble on the holographic controls. They deployed their scouts to our major population centers, but they completely ignored the agricultural sectors. Why? Because they consider us a primitive species unworthy of strategic consideration, Dr. Chakraborty suggested. Or because they don't understand how our civilization actually works, Corvin countered. They're thinking like conquerors control the cities, control the people, but they're missing the fundamental fact that cities don't feed themselves. Admiral Nakamura leaned forward. Go on. Every successful farm operation requires 3 things: understanding your environment, managing your resources, and knowing your opposition. These aliens might have superior technology, but they're operating in our environment now. They don't know our resources, and they clearly don't understand their opposition. Corvin pulled up a colony-wide map, highlighting the agricultural zones. Verdant Prime produces food for 8 other worlds in this sector. We've got the infrastructure to support that kind of operation. Massive irrigation systems, atmospheric processors, soil treatment facilities. All of it could be weaponized if we think creatively. You want to turn farms into battlefields, General Volkov said slowly. I want to turn farms into traps, Corvin corrected. Each species has evolved in a specific environment. Take them out of that environment, expose them to the wrong conditions, and even the most advanced warrior becomes vulnerable. Dr. Chakraborty's eyes lit up with understanding. Environmental warfare. We identify each species' optimal conditions, then create the opposite. Exactly. And we have the perfect testing ground right here. Corvin gestured toward his fields, where the alien landing craft sat like metallic tumors in his crops. They've been kind enough to establish forward bases in controlled environments. All we need to do is modify those environments until we find what works. Over the next 6 hours, they developed what would later be known as the Tilright Doctrine, a systematic approach to xenobiological warfare based on agricultural principles. Each alien species would be studied, categorized, and countered using modified farming techniques scaled up to military applications. The first test came at sunset, when a squad of insectoid aliens emerged from the ship in Corvin's cornfield. Dr. Chakraborty had identified them as vexy hive-minded creatures adapted for high-temperature, oxygen environments. Corvin's solution was elegantly simple. He flooded the field with liquid nitrogen from his grain preservation system while simultaneously pumping pure oxygen into the air. The results were spectacular. The Vex High went into immediate thermal shock, their exoskeletons cracking like eggshells. Those that survived the temperature drop succumbed to oxygen toxicity within minutes. Remarkable, Dr. Chakraborty whispered, recording everything. Their metabolism is completely dependent on atmospheric balance. Alter the gas mixture, and they're helpless. The second test targeted the crystalline entities that had landed near the apple orchard. These beings, designated crystal by Dr. Chakraborty's classification system, appeared to be living minerals powered by electromagnetic fields. Corvin's solution was more complex. He surrounded their landing site with powerful electromagnets salvaged from his grain separators, creating a chaotic field that disrupted their internal energy matrix. The crystal didn't die so much as simply shut down, their crystalline bodies going dark and inert, like computers with corrupted hard drives, by midnight. Corvin had successfully neutralized 6 different alien species, using nothing more than modified farming equipment and a lifetime of practical experience. Each victory added to the growing database of xenobiological vulnerabilities that Dr. Chakraborty was compiling. "It's working," Admiral Nakamura said, though her voice carried the weight of someone who couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. A single farmer with agricultural equipment is systematically defeating an interstellar invasion force. Not just any farmer, General Volkov corrected. A farmer who treats warfare like crop management. Identify the problem, apply the appropriate solution, scale up for maximum effectiveness. Corvin was cleaning his rifle when the next wave of ships appeared in the sky. These were larger than the previous craft, their hulls scarred and battle-tested. As they descended toward his farm, Corvin could see weapon ports opening along their sides. "Looks like word's gotten out," he observed. "They're not underestimating us anymore." Dr. Chakraborty checked her sensors. 12 new species, all unknown classifications, and they're approaching from multiple vectors. They've learned to avoid the kill zones you've established. "Good," Corvin said, surprising everyone. "Means they're adapting. That's useful information." "How is that useful?" Admiral Nakamura demanded. "They're learning from our tactics." Corvin smiled, the expression of a man who'd spent decades outwitting every pest and predator that had ever threatened his crops. Because adaptation takes time and energy, and while they're busy learning to counter our methods, they're not doing what they came here to do. He stood and shouldered his rifle, the familiar weight, a comfort in uncertain times. "Besides, I've got one advantage they can't possibly account for, which is, I'm not trying to conquer anything," Corvin said. "I'm just trying to protect what's mine, and there's nothing more dangerous than a farmer defending his land." The alien ships touched down in formation, their coordinated approach, suggesting tactical sophistication far beyond what they'd shown before. But as Corvin watched them deploy their forces, he was already calculating trajectories, assessing environmental factors, and planning his next moves. After all, the harvest wasn't over yet. 3 weeks into what the galactic news networks were calling the Verdant Prime incident, Corvin's farm had become the most heavily monitored piece of agricultural real estate in human space. Orbital platforms recorded his every move, xenobiologists analyzed his methods, and military strategists tried to reverse engineer his seemingly impossible success rate against superior alien forces. Corvin himself remained largely oblivious to the attention, focused instead on the practical problem of dealing with an ever-increasing variety of hostile extraterrestrial visitors. His latest guests were particularly annoying gaseous entities called Nefari that seemed to exist in a state somewhere between liquid and vapor, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. "They're essentially living clouds," Dr. Chakraborty explained during the morning briefing. Her portable lab now expanded into a full research facility housed in Corvin's converted barn. Their cellular structure is maintained by electromagnetic cohesion. Disrupt that cohesion, and they dissipate like morning fog. "So we need a really big fan?" Corvin asked, genuinely curious. More like a controlled electromagnetic pulse, but yes, essentially a really big fan. Corvin nodded thoughtfully. I can work with that. 2 hours later, he was piloting his ancient crop duster through the middle of a Nefari hunting formation. The aircraft's engine modified to generate massive electromagnetic interference. The gaseous aliens literally dissolved in his wake, their constituent particles scattered to the four winds. Unbelievable, muttered Commander Alexei Kozlov. The newest addition to what had become known as the Verdant Prime Defense Initiative, a career military officer with 3 decades of experience in conventional warfare, Kozlov had arrived expecting to find a sophisticated military operation. Instead, he'd found a middle-aged farmer who treated interstellar combat like an unusually complex pest control problem. Sir, his aide, Lieutenant Karamontros, said quietly, we're receiving communications from the Kepler Foundation. They want to recruit Mr. Tilwright for their xenobiology program, along with the Terran Defense Corps, the Colonial Marines, the Strategic Research Division, and about 15 other organizations, Kozlov replied. He's become quite popular. Will he accept any of the offers? Kozlov watched Corvin land his crop duster and immediately begin preparations for his next sortie. Somehow, I doubt it. He seems to prefer his current position. That current position had evolved considerably since the first alien landing. What had started as one man defending his farm had become a full-scale research and development operation. Military engineers had reinforced Corvin's equipment. Xenobiologists had established permanent research stations throughout his property, and communications specialists had installed a command center in his guest bedroom. Through it all, Corvin continued to treat the situation as a particularly challenging growing season. He woke before dawn, tended to his modified defensive systems with the same care he'd once devoted to irrigation schedules, and approached each new alien species with the methodical patience of a man who'd spent his life learning from the land. The real breakthrough came when Dr. Chakraborty made a connection that had eluded the galaxy's finest military minds. They're not just random species thrown together, she announced during the evening briefing, her excitement palpable. There's a pattern to their deployment. Each species is introduced after the previous one fails, but they're not learning from those failures. They're following a predetermined sequence. Admiral Nakamura leaned forward. Explain. It's like a biological algorithm, Dr. Chakraborty continued. Each species represents a specific environmental niche or tactical approach. When one approach fails, they deploy the next species in the sequence, regardless of whether it's actually suited to counter our specific defenses. Corvin looked up from the tactical display where he'd been planning his next day's activities. Sounds like they're farming. The room fell silent. I'm sorry, Admiral, Nakamura said. Farming, Corvin repeated. They're treating this like crop rotation. Try one species, see what happens, move to the next one. They're not adapting their strategy to our defenses. They're following a predetermined planting schedule. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Dr. Chakraborty was the first to voice what they were all thinking. If they're following a predetermined sequence, then we can predict what's coming next. More than that, Corvin added, we can prepare the appropriate countermeasures in advance. Know your enemy's schedule, and you can be waiting for them. Over the next several days, they worked to decode the alien deployment pattern, using captured data from previous encounters and Dr. Chakraborty's growing database of xenobiological profiles. They began to construct a predictive model of alien behavior. The pattern, when it emerged, was both elegant and terrifying. The invaders were systematically testing every known form of life in the galaxy, deploying species after species in a grand biological experiment, designed to identify the most effective warriors for conquering different environments. Earth and its colonies were just one test site among many. They're conducting a massive comparative study, Dr. Chakraborty realized. Every world they invade becomes a laboratory for testing different species combinations against indigenous defenses. Which means this isn't really an invasion, Admiral Nakamura said slowly. It's a field test. For what? Commander Kozlov asked. Corvin was studying the projected deployment sequence, comparing it to his own experience managing complex agricultural cycles. For the real invasion, he said quietly. They're gathering data on how to defeat every species in the galaxy. Once they have that information, he didn't need to finish the thought. A force that could predict and counter the defensive capabilities of every known species would be unstoppable. Unless, Corvin continued, we can disrupt their data collection. How? Corvin smiled, the expression of a man who'd just solved a particularly complex crop rotation problem, by giving them exactly what they're not expecting. The plan that emerged from that evening's discussion would later be called the Tillwright Protocol. Instead of waiting for aliens to land and then countering them, they would actively invite specific species to engage under controlled conditions designed to produce misleading data. The first test involved the aquatic Marcani, whose deployment was scheduled for the following week, instead of allowing them to choose their own landing site. Corvin prepared a carefully controlled and by a flooded field that appeared to provide ideal conditions for amphibious assault but was actually saturated with agricultural chemicals that would prove lethal to their specific physiology. The Mercani landed exactly where Corvin wanted them to, died exactly as he'd predicted, and transmitted data suggesting that humans possessed advanced chemical warfare capabilities that they'd never actually deployed. The second test was even more successful. Corvin allowed a squadron of aerial Skrithol to establish what they believed was a secure perimeter around his property, then used modified weather control equipment to create atmospheric conditions that sent the creatures into hibernation. To the aliens' monitoring systems, it would appear that humans could manipulate entire planetary weather patterns at will. Within a month, Corvin had systematically corrupted the invaders' entire data collection effort. Every species that engaged his forces transmitted false information about human capabilities, creating a database filled with misleading intelligence. The real test came when the aliens attempted to adjust their strategy based on the corrupted data. They deployed countermeasures for human capabilities that didn't exist while leaving themselves vulnerable to the actual defensive systems Corvin had prepared. It's working, Dr. Chakraborty reported after the latest engagement. Their tactical effectiveness is declining with each encounter. They're fighting the humans they think we are, instead of the humans we actually are. Commander Kozlov shook his head in amazement. A farmer just taught us how to win a war, by losing battles. Not losing, Corvin corrected. Harvesting every engagement provides us with more information about their capabilities, while giving them less accurate information about ours. Eventually, the imbalance becomes unsustainable, and then, Corvin looked out at his fields, where the latest crop of alien debris was being processed by his automated recycling systems. Then we show them what humans can really do when they stop playing by someone else's rules. The message that arrived 3 days later would change everything. It came from the Galactic Council, an organization that most humans had never heard of, and that Corvin certainly hadn't expected to contact him personally. The transmission was brief and to the point. Human Tillwright, your methods intrigue us. We wish to negotiate. Admiral Nakamura looked at the message with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This could be the breakthrough we've been hoping for. Corvin nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. Or it could be the beginning of something much bigger than defending one farm. He was right on both counts. The Galactic Council's ship arrived, not with the thunderous display of the invasion fleet, but with the quiet dignity of a diplomatic vessel making a routine visit. It settled into Corvin's north pasture with barely a whisper, its crystalline hull reflecting the morning sunlight like a prism. Corvin watched from his kitchen window as beings emerged from the ship, representatives of 12 different species, each moving with the careful precision of experienced diplomats. At the center of the group walked a figure that immediately commanded attention. Tall, ethereal, with features that seemed to shift between various alien physiologies, as if the being couldn't quite decide what form to maintain. Ambassador? Vilta, Dr. Chakraborty whispered, consulting her xenobiological database, the Council's chief negotiator. Rumor has it they've mediated conflicts between species that had been at war for millennia. Impressive, Corvin said, refilling his coffee cup. Think they'll want breakfast? The diplomatic party approached the farmhouse with the kind of measured formality that Corvin associated with insurance adjusters and tax assessors people, who were polite right up until they told you something you didn't want to hear. He met them at his front door, still wearing his work clothes and carrying the coffee cup he'd been drinking from. Mr. Tilwright, Ambassador Veltar said, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Corvin's bones. We come seeking discourse. You're welcome to it, Corvin replied. Though I should mention that it's planting season, so I'll need to keep this relatively brief. The ambassador's features shifted, settling into something approximating surprise. Behind them, the other council representatives exchanged glances that suggested they weren't accustomed to being scheduled around agricultural activities. Perhaps, Veltar said carefully, we could discuss the matter inside. 20 minutes later, Corvin's kitchen had been transformed into an impromptu diplomatic conference room. The council representatives occupied every available chair, while Corvin leaned against his counter and continued working on his second cup of coffee. The situation is unprecedented, Ambassador Veltar began. In 17,000 years of galactic history, no single individual has demonstrated the capacity to single-handedly disrupt a collective harvesting operation. Harvesting operation. Admiral Nakamura interjected from her position near the door, the technical term for what you call an invasion, explained Councillor Zethrin, a crystalline being whose faceted surface reflected the kitchen's fluorescent lighting. The collective systematically harvests worlds, extracting resources, evaluating species, and adding suitable specimens to their forces. It is a process that has continued uninterrupted for millennia. Until now, added Councillor Mordock, whose tentacled form writhed nervously. Your methods have not only repelled their forces, but corrupted their entire data collection protocol. The collective's strategic algorithms are now producing tactical assessments with a 73% error rate. Corvin considered this information while sipping his coffee. So you're saying I broke their computer? In the most fundamental sense, yes, Veltar confirmed. Which brings us to our proposal. The Galactic Council wishes to retain your services as a strategic consultant. For what? To teach other species your methods. To transform isolated defensive victories into a galaxy-wide resistance movement. The kitchen fell silent, except for the quiet hum of Corvin's refrigerator and the distant sound of his automated irrigation systems cycling through their morning routine. Through the window, he could see his fields, some scarred by battle, others showing the green promise of new growth. You want me to leave my farm, he said finally. Temporarily, Veltar assured him. Your knowledge could save billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. Corvin nodded slowly, then set down his coffee cup with a soft clink. No. The ambassador's features shifted through several expressions before settling on confusion. I beg your pardon? I said no. Corvin straightened up, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent his life making decisions and living with their consequences. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not leaving my farm. But surely, you understand the implications. Councillor Mordock interjected. The collective will adapt to your methods eventually. When they do, they'll return with overwhelming force. Maybe, Corvin acknowledged. But that's tomorrow's problem. Today's problem is that I've got crops to tend and livestock to feed. I can't save the galaxy if I can't keep my own land productive. Ambassador Veltar's form solidified, taking on a more human-like appearance. Mr. Tilwright, With respect, your personal agricultural concerns seem insignificant compared to the fate of galactic civilization. Corvin smiled at that, the expression of a man who'd heard similar arguments from drought, flood, and pestilence over the years. Ambassador, let me ask you something. What do you know about farming? I fail to see the relevance. Humor me. Veltar's features shifted uncertainly. It involves growing things. That's part of it, Corvin agreed. But the real skill in farming isn't growing things. It's knowing your land. Understanding how every part of your operation affects every other part. You can't manage a successful farm by jumping from field to field, trying to solve problems in isolation. You have to stay put, pay attention, and learn from what the land teaches you. He gestured toward the council representatives. You want me to travel the galaxy, teaching other species how to fight the collective. But fighting isn't what defeated them here. Understanding was. And understanding takes time, patience, and intimate knowledge of the environment you're working in. Then, what do you propose? Veltar asked. Bring them here, Corvin said simply. Turn this farm into a training ground. Let representatives from other species come to Verdun Prime, learn the principles hands-on, then adapt them to their own worlds. That way, I can teach what I know without abandoning what I've learned. The council representatives exchanged glances, communicating through methods that Corvin couldn't interpret, but could recognize as intense negotiation. Finally, Ambassador Veltar nodded. Your proposal has merit. We will need to establish proper facilities, security protocols. And you'll need to respect the fact that this is still a working farm, Corvin interrupted. Any training program happens around the agricultural schedule, not instead of it. And no, not the council, not the military, not the trainees gets to tell me how to manage my land. Veltar's features shifted into what might have been amusement. You drive a hard bargain for someone who's supposedly saving the galaxy. I'm not saving the galaxy, Corvin corrected. I'm protecting my farm. The galaxy just happens to benefit from the overlap. The agreement reached that afternoon would transform Verdun Prime into the galaxy's first interspecies agricultural defense academy. Representatives from dozens of worlds would come to learn what a human farmer could teach them about turning environmental knowledge into tactical advantage. But as Corvin watched the council ship depart, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still ahead. The collective had been quiet for weeks now, longer than any previous gap between their attacks. That kind of patience, in Corvin's experience, usually meant something was planning a comeback, and when it came, he intended to be ready. 6 months after the establishment of the Verdun Prime Agricultural Defense Academy, Corvin's farm had become the most unlikely educational institution in galactic history. Students from 47 different species worked alongside human agricultural engineers, learning to transform farming equipment into defensive systems and crop management techniques into military strategies. The morning briefing took place, as always, in Corvin's kitchen, though the space had been expanded to accommodate beings ranging from the insectoid Kelxhari to the gaseous Aranathi. Dr. Chakraborty, now the Academy's Director of Xenobiological Studies, stood before a holographic display showing the latest intelligence reports. The collective has been quiet for 163 days, she announced. Long-range sensors detect no movement from their staging areas, no scout ships, no reconnaissance activity. They've essentially vanished. That's not good news, observed Commander Kesh, a reptilian saurian, whose species had lost 3 colonies to collective harvesting operations. In our experience, prolonged silence means they're preparing something unprecedented. Corvin nodded from his position at the coffee maker, where he was preparing his morning brew. Same principle applies to pest management. When the obvious threats disappear, that's when you need to start worrying about what you're not seeing. Perhaps they've abandoned this sector, suggested Initiate Yummel, a crystalline being whose species had never encountered the collective. directly. Your methods may have convinced them that resistance here is too costly. No, Corvin said firmly. I've dealt with enough persistent problems to recognize the difference between defeat and regrouping. They're still out there, just not where we can see them. The Academy had proven remarkably successful at producing effective defenders. Students learned to analyze their home environments for tactical advantages, identify alien vulnerabilities through biological principles, and adapt standard equipment for defensive purposes. More importantly, they learned to think like farmers, to see warfare as a long-term exercise in resource management, rather than a series of discrete battles. Recent graduates had already begun the Nexus Prime battle station, hung in space like a malevolent crown, its biomechanical spires pulsing with the sickly green energy that had enslaved 1,000 worlds. Kelvin Brightwater pressed his weathered palm against the viewport of the harvest moon, watching as the combined fleet of the Galactic Liberation Alliance spread out in attack formation around him. Readings are off the charts, reported Commander Vexaria from the bridge of the flagship Stellar Redemption. Her voice crackled through the comm system, tinged with the same disbelief that had colored every military briefing since the human farmer had first stepped forward with his impossible plan. The Dominion's new weapon is drawing power from the enslaved populations of 12 star systems simultaneously. Kelvin's jaw tightened. Through the neural link he'd helped establish between the fleet's ships, he could feel the terror radiating from billions of minds trapped in the Dominion's psychic web. The Kavorthok had perfected their ultimate weapon, consciousness harvester, that could strip entire civilizations of their free will, converting their mental energy into raw power for their war machine. Remember, Kelvin broadcast to the fleet, his farmer's accent somehow lending gravity to words that would have sounded absurd from anyone else. We're not just fighting for our freedom, we're fighting for theirs too. Every soul trapped in that thing is counting on us. The fleet consisted of an impossible alliance. The crystalline ships of the Velthari, their hulls refracting starlight into rainbow patterns. The living vessels of the Mycelio Collective, their organic surfaces breathing with bioluminescent rhythms. Sleek Aryan fighters darting between the larger ships like silver minnows. And at the center, the human agricultural vessels that had been hastily retrofitted with weapons and shields. Brightwater came the voice of Admiral Quintesh, the four-armed hegemony commander who had once ordered Kelvin's arrest. My tactical computers are showing a 97% probability of total fleet annihilation. The Nexus Prime's defenses are beyond anything we've encountered. Kelvin smiled grimly, his fingers dancing across controls that still felt foreign after months of training. Admiral, I spent 40 years fighting drought, disease, and soil depletion on Harvest Prime. The odds were never in my favor then either, but I learned something those computers of yours don't understand. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. As if summoned by his words, the first wave of Kavorthok interceptors swept toward them, sleek, predatory craft that moved with an unnatural coordination born of their shared consciousness. The battle was joined in a symphony of light and violence, the void erupting with the brilliance of energy weapons and the desperate dance of ships fighting for survival. But Kelvin wasn't watching the battle. His attention was focused on the small device in his hands, a modified seed dispersal unit that had been the cornerstone of his farming operation for decades. Inside its reinforced casing lay the culmination of everything he'd learned about cooperation, growth, and the delicate balance between different forms of life. Phase 1 complete, reported Dr. Lysander Voss, the human xenobiologist who had become Kelvin's closest scientific collaborator. The spore delivery systems are primed and ready. The spores, that was the key to everything. Not weapons in any traditional sense, but something far more insidious and ultimately more powerful. Kelvin had studied the Kavorthok's collective consciousness for months, understanding it not as a military strategist would, but as a farmer who had spent his life nurturing symbiotic relationships between different organisms. The Kavorthok believed Their hive mind made them invincible, but Kelvin had recognized the flaw in their system. Like any monoculture, their unified consciousness was vulnerable to the right kind of disruption, and the spores he carried weren't designed to destroy, were designed to diversify. "All ships, this is Brightwater," he announced, his voice carrying the authority he'd never known he possessed. "Execute the pollination protocol. Remember, we're not trying to kill them, we're trying to free them." The modified agricultural vessels swept forward, their cargo holds opening to release clouds of microscopic spores into the vacuum of space. Each spore carried within it a fragment of genetic material from every species in the Alliance, a living testament to the power of diversity over conformity. The Kvorthok ships initially ignored the spore clouds, dismissing them as some primitive human attempt at biological warfare. But as the spores made contact with their biomechanical hulls, something extraordinary began to happen. The spores didn't attack the Kvorthok technology, they integrated with it. Within minutes, the alien ships began to exhibit signs of unprecedented behavior. Instead of moving with perfect coordination, individual vessels started to deviate from their programmed patterns. Some began to communicate with the Alliance fleet. Others simply stopped fighting altogether. "Impossible," breathed Commander Vexeria. "The spores are introducing genetic diversity into their collective consciousness. It's like they're becoming individuals." Kelvin nodded, watching as more and more Kvorthok vessels broke away from their formation. Every farmer knows that the strongest ecosystems are the most diverse ones. The Kvorthok forgot that lesson somewhere along the way. But the Nexus Prime itself remained intact, its massive form bristling with weapons that could obliterate the entire fleet. From its central chamber, the Overmind, the supreme consciousness that controlled the Kvorthok Dominion, reached out with tendrils of pure psychic energy, attempting to reassert control over its fragmenting forces. "Brightwater," came an unexpected voice over the COM system. It was Velinor, the Kvorthok commander, who had been among the first to break free from the collective. "The Overmind is trying to initiate a consciousness cascade. It will destroy every free mind in the galaxy rather than lose control." Kelvin felt the psychic pressure as the Overmind's influence washed over the fleet. Around him, he could see his allies struggling against the alien presence in their minds. But he also felt something else: the support of every species he helped unite. Their diverse thoughts and perspectives, creating a symphony of resistance against the Dominion's monolithic will.